This presentation details a real-life event involving the disappearance and presumed deaths of multiple individuals. Viewer discretion is advised. We are entering white water, nothing seems right. Those were among the last words ever heard from Flight 19. They were spoken not by a panicked rookie, but by a decorated combat flight instructor. He wasn't flying a flimsy biplane. He was leading a squadron of 5 TBM Avenger torpedo bombers, the largest single-engine aircraft of World War II. These were flying tanks, built to withstand heavy enemy fire and ditch in rough seas. On board were 14 men, a mix of seasoned veterans and promising students of the United States Navy. Their mission on December 5, 1945 was utterly routine, a simple 3-hour navigation exercise over the Atlantic. They took off from Fort Lauderdale, Florida, into a clear, calm afternoon. They were never seen again. The rescue mission that followed was one of the largest in history. Hundreds of ships and aircraft scoured over 250,000 square miles of ocean. They found nothing. Not a single life raft. Not a fragment of a wing. Not one oil slick. It was as if 5 10-ton warplanes and the 14 souls aboard had been plucked from the sky. This single event would ignite a modern legend, a mystery that has captivated and terrified us for generations. It drew a dark, invisible triangle on the map of the world, a place where the rules of physics and logic supposedly don't apply. But the real story, the one buried beneath decades of myth, is far more complex and chilling than any fiction. It's a story of human error, bizarre coincidences, and a single fatal decision made by a man who, for some inexplicable reason, stopped trusting his own eyes and his own instruments. A man who led his flight, and a subsequent rescue plane with 13 more men, into oblivion. To understand what created the legend of the Bermuda Triangle, we have to go back to that day. We have to climb into the cockpit and try to solve the one question that still haunts investigators. What could possibly make a decorated combat pilot, flying in perfect weather just miles from his home base, suddenly believe he was somewhere he wasn't? What did he see that made him declare, "Even the ocean doesn't look as it should"? December 5, 1945. Naval Air Station, Fort Lauderdale, Florida. The air is thick with the sweet smell of salt and jet fuel. World War II had ended just 3 months earlier. The frantic energy of combat operations had been replaced by the steady, predictable rhythm of peacetime training. For the pilots and aircrew stationed here, life had a newfound sense of normalcy. The war was won. The pressure was off. These were the lucky ones who had survived. Now their job was to train the next generation. On the flight line, 5 Grumman TBM Avenger torpedo bombers sat gleaming under the Florida sun. These were not sleek fighters, they were behemoths. With a wingspan of over 54 feet and weighing more than 17,000 pounds when fully loaded, the Avenger was a rugged, dependable workhorse of the Pacific theater. It was famously durable, known for bringing its crew home even after taking incredible punishment. Each plane carried a crew of 3. A pilot, a radioman, and a gunner. Today, however, one plane would carry only 2. A total of 14 men were scheduled for Flight 19. Their mission was called Navigation Problem Number 1. It was a training flight so standard, so routine, that it was practically a final exam for the student pilots. The flight plan was simple. Fly due east from the Florida coast for about 140 miles, turn north for 73 miles, and then fly a straight line back to the air station, completing a neat triangle over the Atlantic. The entire flight was scheduled to last about 3 hours. It was a milk run. The man in charge was US Navy Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. At 28 years old, Taylor was an experienced pilot and a seasoned combat veteran with over 2,500 flying hours, many of them in Avengers. He had flown dangerous missions off the aircraft carrier USS Hancock in the Pacific, earning 2 air medals. He knew this aircraft inside and out. He was a professional, a man you trust with your life. But on this particular day, something was off. Taylor had arrived at the base later than usual, and according to records, he had put in a request that morning to be excused from flying the mission. The request was denied. No reason for his request was ever officially recorded. Was it a premonition? A simple headache? We'll never know. But a man who was supposed to lead a flight of trainees tried to get out of it, and was told no. His students were a typical mix of young, eager Navy and Marine Corps aviators. Men like Captain George Stivers and Captain Edward Powers, both decorated Marine officers. Men like Sergeant Robert Gallivan and Private First Class Robert Grubel. They were the future of naval aviation. For them, this was just another day at the office, another box to check in their training log. The weather was beautiful. Official reports from the air station described it as favorable, with scattered clouds and a calm sea state. A perfect day for flying. At 2:10 p.m., the engines of the 5 Avengers roared to life, one after another. The ground crew went through their final checks. The canopies slid shut. With a final wave, Lieutenant Taylor led his flight, call sign Foxterre, down the runway. They lifted off into the bright blue sky, 5 dark shapes climbing in perfect formation, banking east over the coastline and out towards the deep blue waters of the Atlantic. On the ground, the control tower operators watched them go. Just another routine training flight disappearing over the horizon. They had no reason to believe they would spend the rest of their lives wondering what happened in the next few hours. For the first hour and a half, everything was normal. Radio silence was standard procedure during these exercises to prevent students from cheating by using radio direction finders. The flight was supposed to be a pure test of dead reckoning. The art of navigating with only a compass, a clock, and a map. They reached their first turning point over the Hen and Chicken Shoals in the Bahamas. They dropped their practice bombs as scheduled. Everything was going exactly to plan. They made their turn north. And then somewhere over the vast, empty expanse of the Atlantic Ocean, the world turned upside down. Around 4 p.m., long after Flight 19 should have made its final turn back towards Florida, a voice crackled to life over the radio frequency at Fort Lauderdale. It was faint, garbled, but the message was unmistakable. It wasn't a routine check-in. It was a call for help. A senior flight instructor, Lieutenant Robert Cox, was flying near the base when he overheard the transmission. He heard a pilot, who he later identified as one of the students from Flight 19, asking Lieutenant Taylor for a compass reading. What he heard next sent a chill down his spine. It was Taylor's voice, but it was strained, laced with a confusion that bordered on panic. "I don't know where we are," Taylor said. "We must have got lost after that last turn." Cox immediately tried to establish contact. "This is Foxterre 73, he radioed. "What is your trouble?" The reply from Taylor was shocking. "Both my compasses are out and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida. I am over land but it's broken. I am sure I'm in the Florida Keys but I don't know how far down." The Florida Keys. The words hung in the air in the control tower. It was impossible. To be over the Florida Keys, Taylor and his flight would have had to fly south from the Bahamas, not west. They were hundreds of miles off course in the completely wrong direction. It made no sense. A flight leader with 2 compasses, a magnetic and a gyro, couldn't just have both fail simultaneously. And even if they did, a pilot with his experience should have been able to navigate by the sun, which was still high in the afternoon sky. Yet here he was, a combat veteran, completely and utterly lost, believing he was over a string of islands that should have been nowhere in his sight. On the ground, a frantic effort began. They had to find him. They had to guide him home. But as they would soon discover, Lieutenant Taylor had stopped trusting his instruments. He had started trusting something else, something he saw with his own eyes that convinced him he was in a place he couldn't possibly be. And he was about to make a series of catastrophic decisions that would not only seal his own fate, and that of his men, but would also drag a massive rescue plane, and 13 more souls, down with him into the mystery. The mystery began not with a bang, but with a quiet, creeping sense of confusion inside the cockpit of a TBM Avenger. At 2:10 p.m., just over an hour into the flight, Lieutenant Charles Taylor's voice crackled over the radio to the other pilots in his squadron. It wasn't a distress call. Not yet. It was a statement of fact, delivered with the calm professionalism of a seasoned pilot, but laced with an unmistakable undercurrent of bewilderment. "Both my compasses are out," he said, "and I'm trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." Now, for a pilot, a compass isn't just a tool. It's a lifeline. It's the one thing that tells you where you are when all you can see is an endless expanse of blue sky and blue water. Every Avenger was equipped with 2. A standard magnetic compass, the same kind you might use for hiking, and a more sophisticated directional Euro compass. For one to fail was uncommon. For both to fail at the exact same time? That was virtually unheard of. It was like the laws of physics had decided to take a coffee break right inside his cockpit. On the ground, at the Naval Air Station, Senior flight instructor Lieutenant Robert Cox was in the radio room when he heard the transmission. He picked up his mic. "What is your trouble?" he asked. Taylor's voice came back, the calm facade beginning to crack. "I am lost," he said. "I can't see land. I am sure I'm in the Keys, but I don't know how far down." This was the first critical moment, the first link in a chain of disastrous decisions. Lieutenant Cox, a man who knew these waters like the back of his hand, was immediately skeptical. The Florida Keys? That was hundreds of miles south of their planned route. To be there, Flight 19 would have had to make a hard, deliberate turn south for over an hour. It made no sense. Based on their flight plan and departure time, they should have been turning north, heading for home. Cox told Taylor as much. "You cannot be in the Keys," he insisted. But Taylor was adamant. He was the flight leader. He was the combat veteran with over 2,500 hours of flight time. He was convinced he was over the Gulf of Mexico, somewhere near the Florida Keys. The problem was, all available evidence suggested he was exactly where he was supposed to be, out in the Atlantic east of Florida. And this is where the human element, the fragile psychology of a man under pressure, enters the story. Charles Taylor was a good pilot, but he had a history. He'd gotten lost twice before during combat missions in the Pacific, having to ditch his plane in the water both times. It's possible that the specter of these past failures was haunting him, clouding his judgment. He had also recently requested a transfer from Fort Lauderdale, stating he didn't want the assignment. He was a man who perhaps didn't want to be there in the first place, and was now faced with a situation that mirrored his past traumas. While Taylor wrestled with his disoriented mind, 14 other men followed him, their lives hanging on his every word. These weren't anonymous statistics. They were sons, husbands, and fathers. Marine Captain George Stivers, a decorated veteran of the Pacific Theater. Marine Sergeant Joseph Bossi. Navy Seaman Forrest Gerber. Men like Captain Edward Powers Jr., who was married with a child. He was an experienced pilot himself, and he began to question Taylor's judgment. Over the radio, the other pilots in the flight could be heard talking amongst themselves. Their transmissions, faint and scratchy, paint a chilling picture of dawning horror. One student pilot radioed to another, "If we would just fly west, we would get home." It was basic, fundamental aviation knowledge. If you are a pilot flying off the coast of Florida and you get lost, you fly west. You will hit land. It's the single largest, most unmissable landmark available. It's the one thing you are trained to do. Another pilot, likely Powers, transmitted to Taylor, "I suggest we fly due west." But Taylor overruled them. His mind was locked on a single, fatally flawed idea. He believed the landmass he was seeing off his wing wasn't the Florida Peninsula, but the islands of the Florida Keys. He was convinced that flying west would only take him deeper into the vast, empty expanse of the Gulf of Mexico. He was suffering from a severe case of spatial disorientation, a terrifying state where a pilot's senses lie to them, where up feels like down and east feels like west. His response to the suggestion of flying west was chilling. "We have gotten completely lost," he radioed, his voice betraying a rising panic. He then made the single most catastrophic decision of the entire ordeal. He decided that the only way to get his bearings was to fly east, deeper into the Atlantic, deeper into the void. Back at Fort Lauderdale, the control tower staff listened in stunned silence. They were tracking Flight 19's faint radio signals. Their triangulation equipment was primitive by today's standards, but it was giving them a rough position, and it confirmed their worst fears. Flight 19 wasn't over the Gulf of Mexico. They were out in the Atlantic, somewhere off the coast of Central Florida, flying in the right general area but completely and utterly lost. And now, their leader was ordering them to fly in the exact opposite direction of safety. Lieutenant Cox frantically tried to get through to Taylor. He told him to put another pilot in the lead. He told him to turn on his emergency IFF transmitter, a device that would send out a clear signal for rescue crews to lock onto. But Taylor either didn't hear him or ignored him. The radio frequency was a chaotic mess of overlapping transmissions, static, and the faint haunting sound of other commercial radio stations bleeding through. The weather, which had been perfect just hours before, was beginning to turn. The Bermuda High, a semi-permanent weather system in the Atlantic, was kicking up. The sky was darkening. The seas were getting rougher, with waves swelling to over 12 feet. Flight 19 was now not only lost, but they were flying directly into a brewing storm, with fuel tanks that were steadily, relentlessly emptying. Imagine the feeling in those other cockpits. 14 men, most of them young trainees on the cusp of earning their wings, putting their absolute faith in their experienced leader. They had followed him out over the ocean, and now he was telling them that everything they knew, everything they had been taught, was wrong. He was telling them that west was not the way home. He was telling them to ignore the largest landmass on the continent and instead fly towards the endless, featureless horizon of the Atlantic Ocean as a storm bore down on them. The trust that forms the very bedrock of a military unit was beginning to fracture. You can hear it in the scattered radio transmissions. The students are confused. The more experienced pilots are starting to push back, their suggestions becoming more urgent. But the chain of command is absolute. Taylor was the leader, and his word was law. At 4:45 p.m., nearly 3 hours after they took off, Taylor's voice came over the radio again, this time with a new terrifying plan. He believed if they flew east far enough, they would eventually hit the coast of Florida. Assuming they had somehow drifted over the Gulf, when they didn't find land, he made another fateful command. He ordered the flight to turn north, believing they would eventually reach the Florida Peninsula. But based on their actual position east of Florida, this maneuver was only taking them further out to sea, flying parallel to the coastline, but never getting any closer. They were a ghost ship, sailing just over the horizon from their salvation, completely blind to its presence. By now the situation was dire. Their fuel was critically low. The sun was beginning to set, plunging the churning sea below into darkness. The last cogent message ever heard from Flight 19 was from Lieutenant Taylor. His voice was strained but resigned. He was preparing his men for the inevitable. "All planes close up tight," he ordered. "We'll have to ditch unless landfall. When the first plane drops below 10 gallons, we all go down together." That was it. A suicide pact born of desperation and disorientation. The plan was to crash land their planes in the violent, storm-tossed Atlantic, in the dead of night. The chances of anyone surviving such a ditching in those conditions were practically zero. On the ground, a massive search and rescue operation was already scrambling into action. They knew roughly where the planes were. They knew they were running out of fuel. They knew a storm was moving in. The race against time had begun. But as they launched their own aircraft into the darkening sky, they had no idea that the monster that had swallowed Flight 19 was not yet finished. It was still hungry, and it was waiting for them. At 7:27 p.m., two massive Martin Mariner flying boats lifted off from Naval Air Station Banana River. Their call signs were Training 32 and Training 49. They were giants, true behemoths of the sky, designed specifically for long-range patrol and rescue over the open ocean. Each carried a crew of 13 men. Their mission was simple but desperate. Fly into the teeth of the storm, follow the last known trajectory of Flight 19, and find their brothers. The Martin Mariner, the PBM-5, was a workhorse, but it had a dark, well-earned nickname among the pilots who flew it: the Flying Gas Tank. The plane was a marvel of engineering, but it had a potentially fatal flaw. Its wings were packed with fuel tanks, and the cabin was often filled with gasoline vapors. A single stray spark from a loose wire, a static discharge, even a drop tool, could turn the entire aircraft into a 30-ton fireball. Every man who flew in a Mariner knew the risk. They accepted it as part of the job. Tonight, the crew of Training 49, led by Lieutenant Walter G. Jeffrey, were not thinking about that. They were thinking about the 14 men of Flight 19, lost somewhere in the churning darkness below. As they climbed into the violent, storm-tossed sky, the conditions were appalling. Rain lashed against the cockpit windows in horizontal sheets, and the wind howled, trying to tear the wings from the fuselage. Below them, the Atlantic was a raging monster, with waves cresting at over 50 feet. It was a hellish night to be flying, but this is what they trained for. This was the moment their country needed them. At 7:30 p.m., just 3 minutes after takeoff, Training 49 radioed in a routine position report. They were climbing to their assigned search altitude, proceeding on course. The voice on the radio was calm, professional. Everything was normal. It was the last message anyone would ever hear from them. 10 minutes later, at 7:40 p.m., the crew of Training 32, the other Mariner flying a parallel search pattern miles away, tried to make contact. Silence. They tried again. More silence. A cold knot of dread began to form in the stomachs of the crew. But they weren't the only ones out on the water that night. The cargo ship SS Gaines Mills was chugging its way through the storm, heading north along the Florida coast. At approximately 7:50 p.m., the captain and several crew members on the bridge saw something that made their blood run cold. They saw a sudden brilliant flash of light in the sky, off their port side. It wasn't lightning. This was different. This was a massive orange and red fireball that blossomed in the night, hung there for a moment, and then fell towards the ocean in a shower of burning debris. The captain later reported seeing what looked like a plane exploding, bursting into flames as it dropped. He immediately plotted the position and radioed the authorities. Another ship, the tanker SS Esso Greensboro, also witnessed the event. Its crew saw a great burst of flame in the sky, followed by a pillar of fire falling into the sea. They raced to the location, hoping to find survivors. When they arrived, the scene was grim. The air was thick with the smell of high-octane aviation fuel. A huge oil slick covered the surface of the water, burning with an eerie flickering light. They searched the debris field for hours, circling through the wreckage and the waves. They found no bodies, no life rafts, no survivors, just the oily, burning ghost of an aircraft. The search for one lost flight had just become a search for two. The 14 men of Flight 19 were now joined by the 13 men of Training 49. 27 naval aviators had vanished in the space of a few hours, all within the same small patch of the Atlantic Ocean. Back at the command centers, the news of the explosion hit like a physical blow. The location reported by the SS Gaines Mills was directly on the flight path of Training 49. There was no doubt what had happened. The flying gas tank had lived up to its deadly reputation. A stray spark, a faulty pump, a moment of bad luck. In the violent, turbulent air of the storm, something had gone catastrophically wrong. The Mariner had disintegrated in mid-air. The crew would have had no time to even understand what was happening. One moment they were heroes on a rescue mission. The next they were gone. The irony was devastating. A rescue plane sent to save the lost had itself been lost with all hands. The monster that had swallowed Flight 19 had claimed its pursuers. The very act of searching had doubled the death toll. This second, horrifying disaster fundamentally changed the nature of the event. This was no longer just a case of 5 planes getting lost. This was something else. The disappearance of Flight 19 was a mystery. The explosion of Training 49 was a known violent tragedy. But happening on the same night, in the same area, under the same storm, the two events became tangled together, woven into a single terrifying narrative. It felt less like a coincidence and more like a curse. The Navy, stunned but resolute, now faced an unprecedented crisis. They escalated the search to a level never before seen. As dawn broke on December 6th, the full might of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet was unleashed. More than 300 boats and aircraft were mobilized. Destroyers, escort carriers, patrol bombers, and Coast Guard cutters swarmed the area. The search grid covered 250,000 square miles of ocean, from the coast of Florida, across the Bahamas, and out into the vast empty expanse of the Atlantic. It was one of the largest air and sea searches in history. For 5 straight days they scoured the ocean. Pilots flew low, their eyes raw from staring at the endless blue-gray waves, searching for any sign of wreckage, an oil slick, a life raft, a body. Sailors stood watch on the decks of ships, scanning the horizon until the sun and sea blurred into one. They were looking for anything. A piece of a wing, a seat cushion, a single flight jacket. Something to prove that 27 men and 6 aircraft hadn't just been erased from existence. They had the last known position of Flight 19. They had the exact coordinates where Training 49 had exploded and fallen into the sea. They knew where to look. And yet, day after agonizing day, they found nothing. Absolutely nothing. The oil slick and a few small pieces of debris from Training 49 were found by the tanker on the night of the explosion. But by morning, the storm had scattered it all. The ocean had washed away the evidence. And as for Flight 19, it was as if the 5 Avenger torpedo bombers and their 14 crewmen had never existed at all. Not a single scrap of metal. Not a single trace. How is that possible? How can 5 military aircraft, each weighing over 7 tons, simply vanish without a trace? And how can a massive flying boat, which was seen exploding by multiple credible witnesses, leave behind almost nothing. The Navy investigators were stumped. The public was horrified. The families of the missing men were trapped in an agonizing limbo, clinging to a sliver of hope that was shrinking with every passing hour. The press, sensing a story far stranger than a simple training accident, began to ask questions. Questions that didn't have easy answers. The search was officially called off on December 10th. After 5 days of the most intensive search operation imaginable, the official report was stark and chilling. The cause of the loss of Flight 19 could not be determined. The fate of its crew was unknown. The wreckage of Training 49 was unrecoverable. 27 men were gone. 6 aircraft were lost. And all the power of the United States Navy had found was an empty ocean. An ocean that seemed to be guarding a terrible secret. The official investigation was over, but the real story, the legend, was just beginning. Because when the facts run out, speculation takes over. And in the absence of wreckage, in the deafening silence left behind by the vanished men, a new and terrifying idea began to take shape. An idea that this wasn't just a tragedy. It was a mystery that defied all logic. A puzzle whose pieces didn't fit. A dark spot on the map where the rules of our world no longer seemed to apply. The silence that followed was heavier than any storm. For days, the sky had been filled with the drone of search planes, the sea churned by the hulls of destroyers and cutters. Now there was nothing. The Navy officially called off the massive search on December 10, 1945. 27 men, 6 aircraft, and a vast expanse of the Atlantic Ocean were simply gone. For the families, it was the beginning of a lifetime of unanswered questions. A grief with no closure, no final resting place to visit. For the United States Navy, it was an unprecedented failure and a public relations nightmare. In the sterile fluorescent-lit rooms of the Naval Air Station in Fort Lauderdale, a different kind of search began. This one wasn't for wreckage, but for answers. A formal Navy Board of Inquiry was convened, 5 senior officers tasked with the impossible, to explain the unexplainable. The pressure was immense. This wasn't just about finding a cause. It was about restoring faith. Faith in Navy training, faith in their technology, and faith in the very idea that a squadron of state-of-the-art warplanes couldn't just vanish from the face of the earth in broad daylight. From the very beginning, the board had a primary suspect. It's the simplest, most logical explanation in any military disaster: human error. And in this case, the human at the top of the chain of command was Flight Leader Lieutenant Charles Carroll Taylor. The narrative was clean, convenient. A decorated combat veteran, yes, but perhaps he had an off day. Perhaps he was rusty, having recently been transferred from Miami. Maybe he panicked. It was a tidy box to put the tragedy in. It assigned blame, created a lesson to be learned, and allowed the Navy to move on. The board began meticulously sifting through the evidence, confident they would find the simple mistake, the one wrong turn that led to disaster. They laid out Taylor's flight record: over 2,500 flying hours. A veteran of the Pacific Theater, a man who had flown combat missions off the deck of the USS Hancock. This was not a novice. This was a seasoned professional, an instructor responsible for training other pilots. The idea that a man of his caliber would simply get lost on a routine training flight over his own home coast, it felt thin. Then they turned to the radio logs, the ghostly, disembodied transcript of a squadron falling apart in real time. And this is where the simple narrative of pilot error began to fray at the edges. Taylor's first confused transmission: "Both my compasses are out and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." Not one compass, both. The standard magnetic compass and the gyro compass. For one to fail was uncommon. For both to fail simultaneously was almost unheard of. But it got stranger. As the board members read on, they saw the other pilots in the flight chime in. One pilot was heard asking another for his compass reading. Another transmission, garbled and faint, seemed to suggest their instruments were, quote, going crazy. The board was now faced with a chilling possibility. Was it conceivable that the compasses on all 5 aircraft were malfunctioning at the same time? The statistical probability of such a mass failure was so infinitesimally small as to be functionally zero. It defied the laws of mechanics and engineering. It was, for all intents and purposes, impossible. Yet the transcript suggested it was happening. So they moved on. If it wasn't the pilot's skill, and it wasn't the instruments, it had to be the weather. A sudden violent storm could explain everything. It could confuse a pilot, toss planes around like toys, and send them into the sea without a trace. They pulled the official meteorological reports for the afternoon of December 5th. The reports were unequivocal. The weather over the Bahamas and off the Florida coast was clear. Sea state moderate to rough. Wind speed steady. Visibility excellent. Pilots who had flown in the same area on the same day were interviewed. They all said the same thing. It was a beautiful day to fly. But again, the radio logs told a different story. Taylor's own words, relayed through another pilot, spoke of being in a storm. He reported white water, a term for high breaking waves. He said he couldn't see the sun. How could 5 Navy pilots be in a terrifying storm that no one else saw, and that didn't exist on any weather chart? The investigators were stumped. They could either believe their own meteorological data, or they could believe the last words of dying men. The two realities could not coexist. The most damning piece of evidence, the one that seemed to seal the case for pilot error, was the question of location. Taylor was convinced, absolutely certain, that he was over the Florida Keys. He believed he had accidentally flown south. His entire plan for getting home was based on this one single assumption: fly north and he would eventually hit the Florida mainland. But the radio direction finding stations on shore told a terrifyingly different story. The triangulation of his signals placed Flight 19 not over the Keys, but far to the north, off the coast of New Smyrna Beach, almost exactly where they were supposed to be. They weren't lost in some remote, unknown part of the ocean. They were practically in their own backyard. Lieutenant Commander Don Poole, the senior flight instructor on duty that day, testified before the board. You can imagine him recounting those frantic hours. He had been in the radio room, listening to Taylor's voice, a voice he knew well. Poole had begged Taylor to trust his instruments, to turn on his emergency IFF transmitter, so they could get a solid lock on his position. Taylor refused. He was the flight leader. He was sure he was in the Keys. Poole knew with sickening certainty that Taylor was wrong, that every minute he flew north, based on his flawed assumption, he was actually flying deeper and deeper into the vast, empty expanse of the North Atlantic. Why? Why would an experienced pilot, a man trained to trust his instruments above all else, suddenly disregard them? Why would he ignore the frantic pleas of the men on the ground who could see where he was? The board had no answer. Some speculated that Taylor, having just moved from a base in Miami, had simply gotten confused, mistaking some of the bomb-on islands he saw below for the Florida Keys, a place he knew better. It was a plausible theory, but it felt weak. It felt like an excuse, not an explanation. It didn't account for the compass failures, the phantom storm, or the shared confusion among all 14 airmen. The Board of Inquiry was trapped. Every logical path they took led to a dead end, a contradiction. Pilot error? But Taylor was an expert, and what about the other 4 pilots? Why didn't one of them break formation and trust their own instruments? Mass equipment failure? Statistically impossible. A freak weather event? It existed only in the transmissions of Flight 19 and nowhere else. They had no bodies, no wreckage, no oil slick, nothing. All they had were ghosts on the radio and a gaping hole in the fabric of a normal Tuesday afternoon. The Navy needed a conclusion. The families deserved one. So, after weeks of investigation, the 5 officers wrote their report. Their primary finding was damning. They laid the blame squarely on Lieutenant Charles Taylor. Pilot error. Case closed. But then, in the final summary, they added 5 words. 5 words that revealed their own deep uncertainty. 5 words that admitted the tidy narrative of pilot error didn't truly fit the bizarre and terrifying facts. 5 words that would pry open the door for decades of speculation, myth, and fear. After blaming the pilot, the Navy officially concluded that the loss of Flight 19 was for causes or reasons unknown. It was an official military-grade admission. We have no idea what happened out there. And with that single haunting phrase, the US Navy had just laid the foundation stone for a legend that would swallow Flight 19 whole and grow to engulf a vast, mysterious patch of the Atlantic Ocean forever. The Navy's Board of Inquiry convened, a somber assembly of high-ranking officers tasked with dissecting the disaster. They were faced with a puzzle that had no right angles, no straight edges. They had 5 state-of-the-art aircraft, 14 highly trained airmen, and a vast empty sky that had simply swallowed them. The transcripts were read and reread, the garbled messages analyzed until the words lost all meaning. They plotted and replot the supposed flight path, their pencils tracing lines over the ocean that led to nowhere. Their initial conclusion was as swift as it was brutal. They pinned the blame squarely on the shoulders of one man, Lieutenant Charles Taylor. They painted a picture of a flight leader who became hopelessly disoriented, whose compasses failed, and who, in a state of panic or confusion, led his men out into the oblivion of the open Atlantic. The official report cited pilot error. It was a neat, tidy explanation. Closed the case file. It assigned blame, which is often the bureaucratic substitute for finding answers. For the Navy, it was an attempt to cauterize a bleeding wound, to explain away the inexplicable loss of 5 of their prized Avenger torpedo bombers and the 14 men aboard them. It was a story of human fallibility, a tragic but understandable accident. But there was one person who refused to accept this story. One person who knew it was wrong in her bones. Catherine Taylor, Charles Taylor's mother. She wasn't an admiral or an investigator. She was a mother who had just lost her son. And she would not stand by and allow his name, his reputation as a decorated combat veteran with over 2,500 flying hours, to be tarnished. She believed the Navy was using her son as a scapegoat to cover up something they couldn't explain. So she launched her own investigation. She hired lawyers, she wrote letters, she petitioned anyone who would listen. She argued that if Taylor's compasses were malfunctioning, he was trained to rely on other instruments, on the sun, on standard procedure. He was not a rookie who would panic at the first sign of trouble. She pointed out that the Navy's own report was full of contradictions, that other experienced pilots who reviewed the case found the pilot error conclusion to be flimsy at best. Her fight was relentless. 4 months, she was a thorn in the side of the Navy's administrative machine. And incredibly, she won. After reviewing the case again, under pressure from Catherine Taylor's campaign, the Navy amended its report. The finding of pilot error was struck from the record. In its place, they wrote 2 words that were far more accurate and infinitely more chilling. Causes unknown. Causes unknown. With that, the official story died. And in the vacuum it left behind, a legend began to breathe. The story of Flight 19, now officially an unsolved mystery, escaped the confines of military reports and spilled into the public imagination. Newspapers, which had initially reported it as a tragic loss, began to revisit the story with a new angle. It was no longer just an accident. It was the Lost Patrol. The name itself had a romantic, almost mythical ring to it. It conjured images of brave men flying off into the sunset, on a mission from which they would never return. And then the other stories started to surface. Old sailors' tales, once dismissed as maritime folklore, were dusted off and re-examined. Whispers of other ships and planes that had vanished in that same stretch of water began to circulate. There was the USS Cyclops, a massive Navy collier that disappeared without a trace with over 300 souls aboard in 1918. The Carroll A. Deering, a 5-masted schooner found wrecked and abandoned off Cape Hatteras in 1921, its crew gone, the only living thing aboard a 6-toed cat. Individually, they were tragedies, maritime mysteries, but when placed alongside the story of Flight 19, they started to look like a pattern. A terrifying, unexplainable pattern. People began to connect the dots, drawing lines between these disparate events, creating a constellation of disappearance on the map of the Atlantic. And at the heart of this new dark constellation was the final desperate flight of Charles Taylor and his men. The public was captivated. This was 1945, 1946. The world had just endured years of brutal, tangible warfare. People understood enemies you could see, battles you could fight. But this was different. This was an invisible enemy. An enemy that left no wreckage, no survivors, no answers. It was a mystery that played on a deeper, more primal fear. The fear of the unknown, the fear of being erased from existence without a sound. It was in this fertile ground of fear and speculation that the first seeds of the supernatural were sown. In the April 1950 issue of the Miami Herald, a journalist named Evie W. Jones wrote an article detailing the mysterious disappearances of ships and planes between the Florida coast and Bermuda, highlighting Flight 19 as the most incredible of them all. He noted the eerie pattern, the way these vessels seemed to be swallowed up. This was one of the first mainstream media pieces to group these incidents together, to suggest that something was fundamentally wrong with this patch of ocean. 2 years later, in 1952, a writer for Fate magazine, George Sand, took it a step further. In an article titled "Sea Mystery at Our Back Door," he laid out a series of disappearances, including Flight 19, and proposed that they could be linked to some kind of paranormal phenomenon. He was one of the first to suggest that these were not mere coincidences, but evidence of an active, malevolent force at work. He drew a vague, triangular area on the map and filled it with questions. Could it be a gateway to another dimension? A hunting ground for extraterrestrial visitors? This was the turning point. The narrative was no longer about a military accident or even a collection of maritime tragedies. It was now a ghost story, a science fiction plot unfolding in the real world. The flimsy explanation of pilot error had been replaced by causes unknown, and causes unknown was now being replaced by 100 sensational theories, each one more fantastic than the last. The legend was beginning to take shape, built upon the foundation of the Navy's own bafflement and fueled by a public hungry for a mystery that transcended the mundane horrors of the known world. The disappearance of Flight 19 was no longer just about 14 men. It was becoming a symbol for everything we don't understand about our own planet. The story was a runaway train, and it was about to meet the man who would lay the tracks for its journey into global infamy. A man who would give the mystery a name, a shape, and a power that would endure for generations. He would collect the whispers, the folklore, and the facts, and weave them into a tapestry of terror so compelling that the world would have no choice but to look. He would take the scattered points on a map and connect them, not with a pencil but with a legend, and he would call it the Devil's Triangle. The man who would draw this triangle was not an admiral, not a scientist, and not an official investigator. He was a writer, a professional storyteller named Vincent Gaddis, a man who had cut his teeth in the lurid, sensational world of pulp magazines. Gaddis understood human nature. He knew that people weren't satisfied with mundane explanations for profound tragedies. He knew that a complicated story of human error, technical failure, and bad luck was far less compelling than a story about a hungry, malevolent patch of ocean. He understood that the public craved mystery, and he was about to serve them a feast. In the February 1964 issue of Argosy, a popular men's adventure magazine, Gaddis published an article that would change everything. The cover itself was pure pulp brilliance, illustrations of crashing planes and sinking ships, with bold, alarming text. But it was the title of Gaddis's feature that would echo through the decades: the deadly Bermuda Triangle. It was the first time that phrase had ever been printed. With those 4 simple words, Gaddis gave a name to a formless dread. He took a vague region of the Atlantic and turned it into a proper noun, a place with a reputation, a villain with a calling card. Gaddis's article was a masterclass in myth-making. He began with Flight 19, presenting it as the cornerstone of his entire theory. But the version of Flight 19 he described was a carefully curated highlight reel of the strange and the unexplained. He painted a picture of 5 veteran pilots, led by a seasoned combat instructor, taking off on a routine flight under a clear, sunny Florida sky. He described the ocean below as being as calm as a mill pond. In his telling, there was no hint of building storms, no mention of Lieutenant Taylor's recent and disorienting transfer to Fort Lauderdale, no discussion of his history of getting lost. Instead, Gaddis focused entirely on the bizarre radio transmissions. He quoted the most chilling lines stripped of their context. "Everything is wrong, strange. We can't be sure of any direction. It looks like we are entering white water. We're completely lost." He presented these fragments as the last words of men being pulled into another dimension, not as the confused reports of a disoriented flight leader struggling with malfunctioning equipment in deteriorating weather. He conveniently omitted the parts of the transcript where other pilots in the flight expressed confusion about Taylor's decisions, or the parts where ground control was trying desperately to get a fix on their position. He sanded off all the rough edges of reality, leaving behind a smooth, terrifying, and perfectly unsolvable puzzle. For Gaddis, the disappearance of the Martin Mariner search plane wasn't a tragic but understandable accident caused by a well-known design flaw. No, it was victim number 6. He wrote that the giant flying boat, sent to rescue the Avengers, had itself vanished without a trace, swallowed by the same mysterious force. He neglected to mention the crew of the SS Gaines Mills, who saw the explosion in the sky and reported the massive oil slick and debris field. In the world Gaddis was building, things didn't explode, they simply ceased to be. But Flight 19 was just his opening act. The genius of Gaddis's article was that he didn't treat it as an isolated incident. He presented it as the latest link in a long, sinister chain. He reached back through history, cherry-picking other maritime and aviation disasters that had occurred in the same general area. He resurrected the story of the USS Cyclops, a massive Navy collier that disappeared with over 300 men in 1918. He brought up the Star Tiger and the Star Ariel, two British airliners that vanished in 1948 and 1949. He listed freighter ships, private yachts, and military planes. Individually, each of these events had its own set of circumstances, its own plausible explanations: storms, mechanical failures, human error. But Gaddis wasn't interested in individual explanations. He was a pattern seeker. He swept all the messy details under the rug and presented the world with a clean, terrifying list of victims. He drew a line connecting Miami, Bermuda, and San Juan, Puerto Rico, and declared everything inside this boundary a hole in the sky, a place where the laws of physics seemed to break down. He suggested strange magnetic anomalies, atmospheric aberrations, even gateways to another dimension. He didn't offer proof. He offered tantalizing questions and spooky coincidences. And America in 1964 was ready to listen. This was a nation standing on a knife's edge. The Cold War was at its peak. Schoolchildren were practicing duck-and-cover drills, and the threat of nuclear annihilation felt terrifyingly real. The space race was on, filling the night sky with new, man-made stars and filling people's imaginations with the possibilities of what else might be out there. The Roswell incident was less than 2 decades old, and the UFO phenomenon was moving from the fringe into the mainstream. There was a deep cultural anxiety, a sense that humanity was meddling with forces it didn't understand, and a corresponding hunger for mysteries that transcended everyday life. Into this fertile ground, Vincent Gaddis planted his seed of the deadly Bermuda Triangle. It was the perfect modern mystery. It wasn't an ancient ghost story or a medieval legend. It was a technological horror story. It involved the most advanced machines of the age, mighty warships and powerful aircraft, being defeated by an unseen, unknown force. It suggested that for all our progress, for all our science and engineering, we were still just children playing on the shore of a vast, dark ocean. The triangle was a terrestrial black hole, a patch of alien territory right here on Earth. Gaddis's article in Argosy was a sensation. It was reprinted, retold, and discussed across the country. It was the spark that lit the bonfire. He had provided the name, the location, and the foundational list of victims. He had written the first chapter of a legend that was about to go global. Other writers, seeing the public's insatiable appetite for the mystery, would soon pick up the torch. They would dig up more cases, propose even wilder theories, and embellish the story of Flight 19 until it was almost unrecognizable. Gaddis had opened Pandora's box, and the man who would take its contents and build an empire from them was waiting in the wings. He was a linguist, a diving enthusiast, and a man with an even greater flair for the dramatic than Gaddis himself. He would take the pulp magazine theory of the Bermuda Triangle and elevate it, selling millions of books and turning a regional mystery into a worldwide phenomenon. He would make the story of Charles Taylor and his lost patrol the most famous disappearance in modern history, ensuring that their final, confused hours would be forever intertwined not with navigational error, but with the paranormal. His name was Charles Berlitz, and he was about to make the Devil's Triangle a household name. Charles Berlitz wasn't a pilot, an accident investigator, or a naval historian. He was a linguist, an author, and the grandson of the man who founded the world-famous Berlitz language schools. But more than anything, he was a masterful storyteller who understood a fundamental truth about human nature. We don't just crave answers. We crave extraordinary answers. A story about a training flight getting lost in a storm is a tragedy. A story about 5 military planes being snatched from a clear blue sky by an unknown force, that's a legend. In 1974, Berlitz published a book that would sell over 20 million copies and be translated into 30 languages. It was called simply The Bermuda Triangle, and in its pages, the story of Flight 19 was reborn. It was no longer a confusing series of radio transmissions culminating in a likely crash. It was now the crown jewel of paranormal mysteries, polished and presented with such authority that for millions of readers, it became the undeniable truth. Berlitz's method was devastatingly effective. He took the known facts of the case and subtly, expertly twisted them. He sanded off the inconvenient edges of reality and filled the cracks with pure speculation, presenting it all as fact. Let's start with the weather. The official Navy report, and the testimony of other pilots in the area, clearly stated that the weather on December 5, 1945, started out fine but deteriorated rapidly into a violent storm with high winds and massive waves. This is a critical but mundane part of the story. Berlitz would have none of it. In his telling, the skies were calm and the seas placid. He paints a picture of a perfect flying day, making the disappearance utterly baffling. By erasing the storm, he erased the most logical explanation for the tragedy. Suddenly, the planes didn't fly into a squall. They flew into something else. But his most powerful tool was the manipulation of the radio transcripts. Berlitz popularized dramatic, terrifying quotes that have become synonymous with Flight 19, quotes that feed directly into the supernatural narrative. Phrases like, "Everything is wrong, strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should." He reported a frantic final transmission from one of the crew members, supposedly overheard by a naval base, saying, "Don't come after me. They look like they're from outer space." These are bone-chilling words. They conjure images of alien abduction, of portals to another dimension. They are also complete fabrications. Not a single one of these sensational quotes appears in the official unedited 500-page Navy report. The actual transcripts are filled with confusion about direction, discussions of compasses, and worries about fuel. But there is absolutely zero mention of strange oceans, outer space, or anything paranormal. Berlitz, or the sources he cited without verification, simply invented them. And they worked. Those fake quotes became the most remembered part of the entire incident, the proof that something unexplainable had happened. He also reshaped the characters involved. Lieutenant Charles Taylor was no longer presented as a capable but fallible pilot who was new to the area and had a history of getting lost. In Berlitz's version, Taylor was an unflappable, experienced combat veteran with thousands of flying hours. This exaggeration was crucial. If a top-tier, ace pilot got so hopelessly lost on a routine flight, it couldn't be simple human error. It had to be an external, mysterious force. The student pilots, too, were portrayed as seasoned airmen, not trainees on just their second or third navigation leg over water. He transformed a training flight into an elite squadron, making their demise all the more inexplicable. Then there were the compasses. Berlitz seized on Taylor's report that both of his compasses were out. He presented this as a bizarre supernatural event, a key feature of the triangle's mysterious influence. What he conveniently omitted was that the magnetic compass on the Avenger was notoriously unreliable, and that the gyro compass could also be thrown off by abrupt maneuvers or malfunction. More importantly, he failed to mention that every other plane in the flight had its own set of working compasses. The problem wasn't some cosmic force scrambling their instruments. The problem was that the 4 student pilots were ordered to trust their flight leader, and their flight leader was trusting his own faulty equipment instead of the working instruments in the planes right beside him. Berlitz's book hit the public at the perfect time. The 1970s were a golden age for paranormal speculation. Books about ancient astronauts, UFOs, and psychic phenomena were flying off the shelves. The public was hungry for mystery, for the idea that there were forces in the world beyond our understanding. The Bermuda Triangle fed that hunger perfectly. It provided a single terrifying explanation for a whole host of unrelated incidents. The disappearance of the USS Cyclops in 1918, the Triangle, the loss of the transport planes Star Tiger and Star Ariel in the late 1940s, the Triangle. Flight 19 was the book's opening chapter, and its most compelling piece of evidence. Berlitz used the dramatic, twisted version of that story to establish the Triangle's credibility. Once the reader accepted that 5 military planes and their rescue craft could be plucked from the sky by a mysterious force, it was much easier to believe the same force was responsible for every other ship or plane that ever went missing in that vast expanse of ocean. He created a pattern out of chaos, a conspiracy out of coincidence and tragedy. For decades, the Berlitz version of the story was the only one most people knew. The official Navy report, with its detailed analysis of navigational error and weather, gathered dust in archives. The myth was just so much more compelling than the truth. It seemed unassailable. But while millions were captivated by the mystery, one man was captivated by the inconsistencies. His name was Lawrence David Couch. He wasn't a famous author or a paranormal investigator. He was a librarian at Arizona State University and a private pilot. And as requests for information about the Bermuda Triangle flooded his library, he noticed something strange. Every book and article seemed to just repeat the same dramatic stories, often adding new, even more sensational facts. But no one ever seemed to cite their original sources. Kush decided to do what no one else had bothered to do. He decided to hunt down the primary documents. He filed Freedom of Information Act requests. He obtained the complete, unedited Navy Board of Inquiry report on Flight 19. He tracked down old weather reports, shipping logs, and newspaper articles from the days of each supposed mysterious disappearance. He wasn't trying to protect a theory or sell a book. He was a librarian, a researcher, driven by a simple, powerful question. What really happened? He had no idea that his quiet, methodical research was about to lead him into a direct confrontation with one of the biggest literary phenomenons of the 20th century. Charles Berlitz had built a legend out of speculation and fantasy. Larry Kush was about to dismantle it, piece by painstaking piece, with the one thing the legend couldn't withstand: the facts. And Larry Kush was a man obsessed with facts. He wasn't a paranormal investigator or a treasure hunter. He was a librarian and a pilot from Arizona, and for 3 years, he embarked on a quest that no one else had bothered to undertake. He decided to stop reading the sensationalized books and articles and go directly to the source. Kush wrote letters, hundreds of them. He wrote to the Navy, the Air Force, the Coast Guard. He requested the complete, unedited Board of Investigation report on Flight 19, a document over 400 pages long that the mythmakers had either ignored or cherry-picked from. He tracked down weather station data for that specific day, interviewed surviving family members, and cross-referenced every single claim he could find. What he uncovered wasn't a paranormal conspiracy. It was a conspiracy of sloppy journalism, embellishment, and outright fabrication that had been repeated so many times it had solidified into truth. His 1975 book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, was the ultimate rebuttal. It was a systematic, methodical dismantling of the entire legend, and it started with the very foundation of the story: the weather. Charles Berlitz, and nearly every author before him, painted a picture of a perfectly calm, sunny Florida afternoon. A routine flight on a beautiful day. This was essential to the mystery. If the weather was perfect, the planes must have been taken by some unseen force. But Kush pulled the actual weather reports from December 5, 1945. And the reality was completely different. While the flight took off in decent weather, conditions over their flight path and out over the Atlantic were rapidly deteriorating. Forecasters had predicted high winds and intermittent rain showers. By late afternoon, the seas were described in official reports as high and rough. The winds were gusting, churning the ocean into a white-capped frenzy. This wasn't a calm paradise. It was a challenging environment for any pilot, let alone students. The serene, beautiful day that was so crucial to the mystery. It never existed. Next, Kush tackled the pilots themselves. The legend described them as seasoned combat veterans, an elite squadron of experienced aviators who could fly these planes in their sleep. This too was a gross exaggeration. Yes, the flight leader, Lieutenant Charles Taylor, was an experienced pilot with thousands of flight hours. But the 4 pilots under his command were students. They had only about 300 hours of flight time each, and only 60 of those were in the Avenger. They were capable, but they were trainees. Their job was to follow their leader. And what about their leader? Lieutenant Taylor was an experienced combat pilot, yes. But Kush's research uncovered a critical detail that changed everything. Taylor had only recently been transferred to Fort Lauderdale. He was unfamiliar with the local geography, and more importantly, he had a history of getting lost. On 2 separate occasions during his service in the Pacific, Taylor had become disoriented and had to be guided back to his carrier. He had once even ditched his plane in the ocean and had to be rescued. This wasn't a superhuman pilot incapable of error. This was a man, a very capable man, but one with a known, documented weakness for spatial disorientation. A fatal flaw, as it would turn out. But what about those chilling paranormal radio transmissions? The quotes that sent shivers down the spine of a generation. Everything is wrong. Strange. The ocean doesn't look as it should. We are entering white water. Nothing seems right. These were the supposed last words, proof of an encounter with the unknown. Larry Kush went through the official unedited radio logs, transcript by transcript. and he found that those famous spooky quotes were completely fabricated. They appear nowhere in the official record. Not a single one. The real radio transmissions tell a much different and far more human story. They tell a story not of paranormal terror, but of pure raw confusion. Taylor's first distress call wasn't about strange water or weird skies. It was, "Both my compasses are out and I am trying to find Fort Lauderdale, Florida." He was lost. He believed he was over the Florida Keys, hundreds of miles off course. His students knew he was wrong. You can hear their confusion in the logs. One pilot transmits, "I know where I am. I am at 2,300 feet. Don't fly too far east or we will." And the transmission cuts out. Another pilot urges Taylor to fly west. But Taylor, the flight leader, overruled them. Convinced his instruments were wrong and his own flawed sense of direction was right, he made a fatal decision. Believing he was over the Gulf of Mexico, west of Florida, he ordered his flight to head east, deeper and deeper into the vast, stormy Atlantic. The real transmissions are heartbreaking. They are a record of 5 planes low on fuel, flying into worsening weather, with a leader who is confidently taking them in the wrong direction. There's no mention of aliens or strange phenomena. Just a man who is lost and too stubborn or disoriented to listen to the people who could have saved him. So if there was no paranormal event, where did the planes go? The mythmakers claimed they vanished without a trace. Cush's answer was brutally simple. They ran out of fuel and crashed into the ocean. An Avenger bomber was a heavy aircraft. Once it hit the water, especially in rough seas, it would sink in less than a minute. The crew would have had seconds to escape in the dark into a churning cold ocean. Their chances of survival were virtually zero. Finding the wreckage, even today with modern technology, in an area covering thousands of square miles of deep ocean, would be almost impossible. They didn't vanish. They sank. And finally, Cush turned his attention to the great final act of the tragedy, the disappearance of the Martin Mariner rescue plane sent to find them. Berlitz presented this as the ultimate proof of the Triangle's power. A massive flying boat, sent to rescue the first victims, is itself claimed by the mystery. It vanished just as completely as Flight 19. But again, Cush found this wasn't a mystery at all. It was a well-documented, tragic accident. The PBM Martin Mariner had a nickname among Navy pilots: the Flying Gas Tank. Its massive fuel tanks were known to leak vapors into the fuselage, creating a constant risk of explosion from a single spark. It was a known dangerous flaw with the aircraft. On the night the Mariner disappeared, a ship in the search area, the SS Gaines Mills, reported seeing a massive fireball in the sky. Their log entry is precise. They saw an explosion at 7:50 p.m., at the exact time and in the last known location of the Mariner. They sailed to the spot and found an oil slick and debris, consistent with a plane exploding in midair. The search plane hadn't been taken by a mysterious force. It had tragically, and likely due to its own design flaw, blown up. All 13 men aboard were killed instantly. One by one, Larry Cush took the pillars of the legend and knocked them down with the sledgehammer of documented evidence. No COMSEs, no superpilots, no weird radio calls, no mysterious vanishing. It was a story of a disoriented flight leader, student pilots who followed orders, worsening weather, and a tragically flawed rescue plane. By the time Cush was done, there was nothing left of the mystery. He had solved it. The only question that remained was, would anyone listen? Or was the legend now simply too big, too entertaining, and too profitable to die? Larry Cush's book was a masterpiece of methodical, relentless, fact-based demolition. He had taken the world's greatest mystery and exposed it as a house of cards, built from exaggeration, shoddy research, and outright fabrication. He held up the truth for all to see, and almost no one cared. His book, The Bermuda Triangle Mystery Solved, sold respectably. It was praised by critics, pilots, and maritime experts. But it was a flicker of a candle next to the raging bonfire that was Charles Berlitz's The Bermuda Triangle. Berlitz's book sold over 20 million copies. It was a global phenomenon. It didn't matter that it was filled with the very errors Cush had so carefully debunked. In the court of public opinion, the verdict was in. The mystery was simply a better story. And that story was about to go supernova. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, the Bermuda Triangle wasn't just a theory. It was a cultural institution. It became the subject of countless television documentaries, most famously in an episode of In Search of, hosted by the deep, mysterious voice of Leonard Nimoy, which presented the supernatural theories as credible possibilities. Movies like Steven Spielberg's Close Encounters of the Third Kind directly reference Flight 19, showing the lost airman returning in a UFO, forever cementing the link between the disappearance and extraterrestrials in the minds of millions. The legend had escaped the confines of dusty library books and was now a full-blown media monster. It was everywhere, and the more it was repeated, the more real it seemed. The basic facts of the case: a lost training flight in a storm, were buried under layers of thrilling speculation. Time warps, magnetic anomalies, portals to another dimension, ancient Atlantean energy crystals. Each theory was more exciting than the last, and infinitely more exciting than the mundane truth. Why? Why did the public so overwhelmingly choose the fantasy over the facts? The answer is complex, but it speaks volumes about human nature. Part of it was timing. In the 1970s, in the wake of Vietnam and Watergate, trust in official institutions was at an all-time low. So when the Navy released its official report, stating the cause of Flight 19's loss was unknown, it didn't sound like an honest admission of uncertainty. To a suspicious public, it sounded like a cover-up. It was far easier to believe the government was hiding evidence of aliens or a top-secret weapon than to accept that they simply didn't have all the answers. There's also a deep-seated human need for mystery. As science and technology mapped, explained, and demystified the world, the Bermuda Triangle remained a stubborn pocket of the unknown. It was a place where the normal rules of physics didn't apply, where anything was possible. It was terrifying, yes, but it was also exhilarating. It made the world feel bigger, more magical, and more interesting. Larry Kush offered a world of compass deviation and fuel gauges. Charles Berlitz offered a world of sea monsters and cosmic kidnappers. It wasn't a fair fight. But while the world was enjoying this thrilling new mystery, there was a group of people for whom this was no game. The families of the 27 men who had vanished that day. For 30 years they had grieved in private, holding on to the memory of their sons, husbands, and brothers. Now they had to watch as their loved ones' tragic deaths were turned into a cheap carnival sideshow. Their personal tragedy had become public entertainment. They were especially tormented by the Navy's official report. By blaming causes or reasons unknown, the report implicitly left the door open for pilot error, tarnishing the reputations of all 5 pilots in the flight. But the families, particularly the family of flight leader Charles Taylor, knew this was an injustice. They knew about his confusion, his belief that his compasses were broken, his fatal decision to head east. They also knew he was a decorated combat veteran, a good man who had made a mistake under immense pressure. The sensationalism of the Bermuda Triangle legend made their fight for the truth even harder. Every time they tried to talk about navigational errors and bad weather, they were drowned out by shouts of aliens and time warps. The world didn't want the complicated, human story of a man getting lost. It wanted a ghost story. This put the families in a terrible position. To clear their loved ones' names, they had to argue against the official Navy report. They had to publicly campaign to have the verdict of causes unknown changed to pilot error. Think about that. They had to fight to have their own family member officially blamed for the disaster, just to put an end to the supernatural nonsense and restore a measure of dignity to his memory and the memory of the men who followed him. Meanwhile, official bodies like the US Coast Guard and the Navy were getting tired of the whole affair. They repeatedly issued statements, pointing out that the number of disappearances in the so-called Triangle was no greater than in any other heavily trafficked area of the ocean. They explained that the region was prone to sudden, violent storms, and that the Gulf Stream could quickly obliterate any trace of a wreck. They presented data, statistics, and expert testimony. Their dry, factual press releases were like throwing a glass of water on a forest fire. The legend was now too powerful, too ingrained in the culture. It was profitable. Book publishers, movie producers, and television networks were making millions from the mystery. They had no incentive to kill their golden goose. The truth was bad for business. The desire to believe was so strong that it led to moments of global excitement, followed by quiet retraction. In 1991, a salvage company called Graham Hawkes Ocean Technologies was searching for sunken Spanish galleons off the coast of Florida. Instead, they found something incredible. 5 Grumman Avenger torpedo bombers sitting on the ocean floor in a military formation. The news exploded across the world. Flight 19 had been found. It was the lead story on every news channel. Documentaries were scrambled into production. The discovery was hailed as the beginning of the end of the mystery. Finally, there would be answers. Investigators went down to the wrecks, their cameras ready to find the clue that would solve it all. They checked the bureau numbers, the unique serial numbers painted on the fuselage of every military aircraft. The world held its breath. And then came the quiet, disappointing truth. The numbers didn't match. Not a single one of the planes belonged to Flight 19. They were a collection of other Avengers that had crashed or been ditched on separate training missions over the course of several years. The ocean off the coast of a major naval air station, it turned out, was littered with old planes. It was a stunning coincidence, but nothing more. The discovery that had promised to solve the mystery only ended up deepening it for the public, who mostly heard the exciting news of the discovery and missed the boring correction that came later. The legend had become a self-perpetuating machine, immune to facts, immune to evidence, immune to the pleas of the families it was built upon. The truth, as discovered by Larry Kush, was out there, but it was buried, ignored, and unwanted. The men of Flight 19 and Martin Mariner 49 were no longer pilots or sons or husbands. They were characters in a story, ghosts in a global campfire tale. But for the families, one last battle remained. The fight to have the official record reflect the truth, a decades-long struggle to reclaim the memory of their men from the clutches of the myth they had helped create. For the families of the lost men, the mystery wasn't a thrilling puzzle. It was an open wound. And the US Navy, in its initial attempt to close the book on the tragedy, was about to pour salt right into it. In early 1946, the Navy's 500-page report was finalized. The conclusion was swift and brutal. The blame was placed squarely and solely on one man, Flight Leader Lieutenant Charles Taylor. The official cause of loss was listed as pilot error. The report painted a picture of a confused and incompetent leader who got his men lost and led them to their deaths. For the Navy, it was a neat, tidy explanation. Closed the case. But for the families, it was a profound betrayal. This wasn't just a bureaucratic finding. It was a public condemnation. Charles Taylor, a decorated combat veteran with over 2,500 flying hours and multiple distinguished flying crosses, was now officially branded as the man responsible for the deaths of 13 others. His mother, Catherine Taylor, was devastated. She refused to accept it. She knew her son. She knew his record, his skill, his dedication. She knew he wasn't the kind of man to simply get lost and panic. She believed the Navy was making her son a scapegoat to cover up for something else. Faulty equipment, poor training protocols, or simply the embarrassment of losing 5 aircraft on a routine exercise. And so, Catherine Taylor began a one-woman crusade against the full might of the United States Navy. She wrote letters, hundreds of them, to the Navy, to congressmen, to anyone who would listen. She argued point by point against the findings. She highlighted that Taylor's compasses were known to be malfunctioning. She pointed out that he had requested to be removed from flight duty just days before the incident, a request that was denied. She insisted that an experienced pilot who had just flown in from Miami wouldn't suddenly mistake the Florida Keys for the Bahamas. She gathered evidence, she made phone calls, she refused to be silent. She was a grieving mother fighting not just for her son's reputation, but for the truth. Her persistence was relentless. She was David and the Navy was Goliath. And incredibly, she won. Faced with Catherine Taylor's unyielding pressure and a dawning realization that their own report contained inconsistencies, the Navy Board for Correction of Naval Records re-examined the case. In 1947, they issued a stunning reversal. The verdict of pilot error was officially struck from the record. The cause of the loss of Flight 19 was amended to cause unknown. It was a quiet victory, a correction buried in military paperwork, but for the families, it was everything. It was the restoration of honor. It acknowledged that what happened that day was a genuine, baffling tragedy, not the fault of one man's incompetence. Charles Taylor and his men were no longer symbols of failure, but victims of a terrible and inexplicable fate. But by then it was too late. The legend was already loose in the world. The quiet, bureaucratic correction of a military report stood no chance against the sensational, ever-growing myth. The story of Flight 19 had escaped the confines of military history and was now public domain, a piece of modern folklore being shaped and embellished by writers and storytellers. The official change to cause unknown didn't debunk the mystery. It supercharged it. 'Cause unknown was twisted to mean unknowable, unexplainable, supernatural. The Navy's own words were used as fuel for the fire of paranormal speculation. And this is where we must separate the history from the hysteria. The legend of Flight 19, the cornerstone of the Bermuda Triangle, is built on a foundation of half-truths, embellishments, and outright fabrications. Let's dismantle it piece by piece. First, the myth of the perfect flying day. Accounts of the Bermuda Triangle often begin by describing December 5, 1945, as a bright, clear, sun-drenched afternoon. This creates a stark, unsettling contrast with the disappearance. The reality was far different. While the flight took off in good weather, conditions at sea were rapidly deteriorating. By late afternoon, the men were flying into high winds and intermittent rain squalls. The seas below were described in reports as rough to very rough. This wasn't a placid flight into the twilight zone. It was a flight into a brewing Atlantic storm. Second, the myth of the unflappable veteran pilots. While Charles Taylor was an experienced combat pilot, he was new to Fort Lauderdale. It was his first time flying this specific training route. More importantly, his 4 students were just that, students. They were trainees in the final stage of a 3-month program. They had just 300 hours of flight time, a fraction of Taylor's experience. This wasn't a squadron of Top Guns. It was one experienced but locally unfamiliar instructor leading 4 novice pilots into worsening weather. Third, and perhaps most importantly, is the myth of the bizarre radio transmissions. This is the heart of the legend. Famous quotes attributed to Taylor like "everything is wrong, strange. We can't be sure of any direction. Even the ocean doesn't look as it should," are staples of every documentary and book on the subject. Even more dramatic is the supposed final transmission, intercepted by a naval base, where Taylor allegedly said, "Don't come after me. They look like they're from outer space." These quotes are chilling. They are also completely fabricated. They appear nowhere in the official 500-page Navy report or the radio logs. They were invented decades later by authors like Charles Berlitz to sell books. The real transmissions are far more mundane and far more tragic. They are the words of a man who is lost, confused, and increasingly desperate. A man convinced his compasses are broken, who misidentifies landmarks, and who makes a fatal decision to fly east, deeper into the Atlantic, instead of west toward the setting sun and the Florida coast. Finally, there is the myth that they vanished without a trace. This implies a clean, almost surgical removal from our reality. But the Martin Mariner, the rescue plane with 13 men aboard, almost certainly did not vanish. It exploded. The SS Gaines Mills, a tanker in the area, reported seeing a massive fireball in the sky and an oil slick on the water, precisely where the Mariner should have been. These PBM Mariners were notoriously known as flying gas tanks due to the risk of fuel vapor explosions. The tragic fate of the rescue plane has a tragically simple explanation. As for Flight 19 itself, the Atlantic Ocean is a vast and unforgiving place. In 1945, finding wreckage in deep water, especially after it had been scattered by a storm and carried by the powerful Gulf Stream, was a monumental, if not impossible, task. They didn't vanish into another dimension. They crashed into the sea, and the sea kept its secrets. So why has the myth endured? Why do we, as an audience, prefer the story of a paranormal vortex over the heartbreaking reality of a navigational error, compounded by bad weather and bad luck? Perhaps it's because the myth is more comforting. A supernatural explanation, like aliens or a time warp, places the event outside the realm of human experience. It's a freak occurrence, a cosmic anomaly. Can't happen to us. The truth is far more terrifying. The truth is that even with training and technology, a cascade of small errors can lead to absolute disaster. The truth is that a decorated hero can get lost. The truth is that nature is immensely powerful and indifferent to our plans. The truth is that sometimes, help just doesn't arrive in time. That story is frightening because it's real. It's a story of human fallibility. The legacy of Flight 19 is not a mystery of the cosmos. It is a human tragedy that was hijacked and turned into a global ghost story. The 14 men in those Avenger torpedo bombers and the 13 men in the Martin Mariner were not paranormal statistics. They were sons, brothers, husbands, and fathers. They were airmen serving their country, caught in a fatal storm of confusion and circumstance. Their story should not be about a strange patch of water. It should be about them. It should be about Catherine Taylor's fight for her son's honor. It should be a solemn reminder that behind every great legend, there is often a simple, devastating human truth. The real mystery isn't what happened to Flight 19, but why we chose to forget the men and remember the myth.